to give a little bit of background, in my past life, probably about 25 years ago, I was trained as a life coach. Now, this was a small outfit out of Vermont, and they didn't call it that at the time. And they were a little bit new agey. They called it a prosperity teacher. And anyone that wants to make fun of that name, I'm totally on board with that. I never really felt good about it. But I spent 7 years in these really intense workshops. That there was a lot of examination in it, and I got quite a bit out of it. And so that's where the passion and the sort of level of conversation stems from. It's been a lifelong a hobby of mine, and it's something that I spent quite a bit of time heavily involved in about 20 years ago. And so, and these are just a smattering of books that sort of go into what I'm going to talk about today. So this isn't like a traditional reading circle in that I bring one book to the table. Like I bring a background that is informed by a whole bunch of books, etc. And so I'm going to try to synthesize these and to boil them down in a way that's applicable to business. So just a little background. A lot of these books come from the movement called positive psychology. People have also called it positive thinking. I don't like the term positive thinking. I think there's a lot wrong with that. But positive psychology is different from classical psychology in that classical psychology was really about avoiding or eliminating neuroses and psychoses. And positive psychology said, geez, that's an awful low bar to just say, okay, I'm not neurotic anymore. Positive psychology says, how can we maximize our potential? How can we get from just plain old existing to thriving? This was that was in the original slide. This is the woman that was the Easter egg. She's a Buddhist monk who was recently featured on CNN, and I just love that. I love that facial expression. She's really embodying what I think is what it means to thrive. Now I want to call out one book in particular in that list of books that I had, and this one, Emotional Intelligence 2.0. It's a fairly new book. Emotional Intelligence was a book that came out about 20 years ago, and it posited that it was really less of a determiner of success in life as what they were calling EQ or emotional intelligence. So, but in this particular book, and it just showed up in my house the other day, but because all these books really kind of say the same thing in different ways, I skimmed the gist of it. Now, this particular book, it had lists of strategies of different sort of things that we can improve our emotional intelligence, become more emotionally self-aware, et cetera, et cetera. And there were all here, there were probably 50 different strategies that they gave. And I think that that's great. I think it's a great book. I think that it's definitely worth reading. I think that it would make for a great reading circle topic. But 50 is a lot. So what I want to do to really just give you just one strategy that I have used in my life, and I think that it has been very helpful to me. Now, I highlighted a couple of these in here: lean into your discomfort, take control, make your goals public, visualize yourself succeeding. Those really play into what I'm about to say today, and you'll start to understand. Now, I am also couching what I'm about to say or about to show you in terms of business terminology. Implicit bias. I mean, we all saw the onboarding video about uncovering implicit bias, and I'm really proud to say that I work for a company that has that level of emotional intelligence or awareness that we're culturally thinking about these things. But you know, when we think of implicit bias, we usually think of it in terms of racism, sexism, those kinds of things. And what I'm going to talk about today, a little bit, and it's a little bit of my own theory, it's a little controversial and maybe a little bit of a stretch, but the implicit bias can impact all sorts of things that we do in our just workaday life that have nothing to do with racism, sexism, or any of that stuff. They can actually stop us or limit our potential. All right, so George asked me, I did a dry run with him of this presentation. As a result, I kind of threw out the entire presentation. But he asked me at the end of it, he said, Dan, is there one key takeaway? If you could boil this down to one sentence, what would it be? And so I thought about it, and this is what I came up with. Now, what you see here is a mental habit. I would call it a mental strategy, and I would also call it a game. And I really want to emphasize the game part of it. And when I say that, I'm saying that fully aware that things that we want to achieve, outcomes that we want to achieve, aren't always easy. There are plenty of things that we do throughout our workday, et cetera, that are difficult. What I'm not trying to say here is that everyone should go into playing poker and put ones and threes on all their stories. Absolutely not, because there are things that are objectively difficult. What I am going to argue is that this particular mental strategy, or you could think of it as a game, it assists with bubbling up implicit biases that are just in us, and maybe we're not even aware. So what I would say instead, we're an evidence-driven company, and I think that's great, and I want to continue to be an evidence-driven company. But what I want to talk about is sometimes our implicit biases have us distort the relevance of the evidence in front of us. So, I might, think of the quote, keep your eyes on the prize, as it were. When you keep your eyes on the prize, you're going to be, you're all these distractions that come in, these things that come in that look like they're going to be obstacles, their impact is lessened. Okay, so I need to give you a couple little brain science concepts in order to really drive home what I'm talking about. So this is the first one, and it has to do with how emotions are made. And this is what we typically think of is the way emotions happen. You see something, you have an emotional reaction to it, and then you have some sort of thought or analysis about it. So this name's Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's a psychologist, and she wrote this book, How Emotions Are Made. And she is saying that previous slide is not correct. So here's what she's saying. What really happens is we have a perception, right? And our brain forms a concept of the perception that we just had. And from that concept that we formed, we have an emotion that emerges as a result. Now, this all happens so fast in our brain that it just doesn't feel that way. But as we go through this, you'll see how this difference of understanding how emotions form, it's going to make a difference. So I listen to a lot of podcasts on drive time, and I've heard a whole bunch of podcasts about implicit bias. And the psychologists were talking about this experiment where they made to sort of uncover implicit bias. And they made a deck of cards, and in the deck of cards they had, and I'm going to get this roughly right, but you should understand, they had a bunch of pictures of white people and black people. And then they had a bunch of adjectives that pertain to good or bad. Then they asked the people, they said, okay, what I want you to do is take this deck of cards and sort it. And what I want you to do is I want you to put the black people and the bad adjectives in one pile, and the good people and the white people and the good adjectives in another pile, right? And so the people would do it, and they would time them. And then ask them to do the opposite. They would say, I want you to make two new piles. One is the black people and the good adjectives in one pile, and then the white people and the bad adjectives in another pile, and then they would time them on doing that. Now, this experiment is actually online. It's been done over 1 million times. They've reversed it, so maybe you're asked to do the other way first. And what they're finding is that in lots of cases, people are having a harder time making the sorting piles with the black people and the good adjectives and the white people and the bad adjectives. And what these psychologists are saying is that at some very deep level, and we don't know where this came from, if it's cultural, social, if it came from our parents or what, but at some very deep level, we have wired in us that black equals bad and white equals good. And that these are, when you think about it, it's sort of arbitrary. There's no real sort of evidence-based or logical reason why these two things should be tied together, but here they are tied together. So you can imagine all sorts of, when I put together this slide, I thought I was going to draw the lines, but I don't even need to draw the lines. As you guys are looking at this slide, your brain is already making those connections, and your brain might be looking at, I don't know, it might be looking at women and weak and men and strong, right? So those are some examples of implicit biases. Now, I'm going to argue that there's all sorts of other implicit biases that have to do with any of these. But anyway, I just wanted to get that concept out there. Now, here's another one. Excuse me. So I love this book. I haven't read the whole thing, but I read a lot of it, and it was really fascinating. So this book is in the CIA's library. You can bop over to cia.gov, or I can send people the link to this, and it's the Psychology of Intelligence Analysis. And as you can imagine, in national intelligence analysis, it's really important that our internal or implicit biases don't color our analysis. And he uses an example of way back in when the Ayatollah Khomeini was overthrown. All of our intelligence analysis said that would never happen. And yet it happened, even though all the evidence was right there in front of us, and it was because we had implicit biases that were coloring our perceptions and giving us faulty intelligence. So this is one of the quotes from this book, and it talks about we tend to perceive what it talks about the role that expectation plays in perception. So I'm going to put this slide up real quickly, and if you guys can just skim those quotes, and I'm going to move right along. So what that author Richard Hewers says is that we mistake our perceptions for reality. And so that last little slide I showed was an experiment, and in those slides was actually a grammatical error. So in the slides, the article in each one was repeated twice. So it's Paris in the spring, once in a lifetime, etc. Now, some of you probably saw that the article was repeated twice, but some of you, maybe more of you, didn't see it. And the reason you didn't see it is because expectations of what was going to see actually colored, altered, distorted your perceptions. This is a great quote from the book, and I put it in here because I told you guys 20 years ago when I was being trained as a life coach, the outfit was a little bit new agey, and what they said was your thought, your reality, and there was the scientific side of me really didn't totally buy that, but I kind of went with it anyway. I saw a lot of interesting changes in my life when I started sort of actively curating my but I didn't think it was particularly scientific, and I didn't believe that it was a fully metaphysical idea. Well, the way this guy says it, he really brings it down to reality. This is just brain science. There's nothing metaphysical about it. But the fact that we construct our own version of reality, we need to be constantly aware that that's what we're doing. As we're going through our lives, we see X, Y, or Z happen, right? We have a perception, we form a concept about it, we have a thought, an opinion about it, we might have an emotion about it, but we mistake those things for reality. Okay. So here's a couple more experiments. This one was popular about 10 years ago. It was called, I got to put my glasses on. Oh, the selective attention test. So this one was testing a concept that psychologists call inattentional blindness. They also call it focusing on a problem. So the people in this experiment, and it was done on YouTube, so millions of people did this on their own. And the task you were given was, look at how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball, right? So you're given a task, you watch this for a minute, and then at the end of the task, the experimenter says, okay, did you see the gorilla walk into the scene? And what happened? I'll play it for you, but you can imagine a man in a gorilla suit, and he's not running. He slowly walks into the scene, he stands in the middle of the scene, he beats his chest, and he walks out of the scene. But because we have inattentional blindness, we didn't see a lot of people didn't, I'm sorry, I can quantify that. People did not see the gorilla walk in and out. And so the thing I want to drive home here is that when you expect one thing, it's really easy, because, and this is the way our brains are wired, to miss something more important. Now, this experiment was also done with radiologists. So radiologists were shown this lung scan, and they were asked to look for cancer. And then after the radiologists looked, the experimenters then said to them, "Did you see the gorilla?" And if you look in the upper right, there's the gorilla superimposed on the brain on this lung scan. 83% of radiologists didn't see the gorilla. So inattentional blindness, or looking for something and thereby not looking for something else, can really distort our view of reality. Okay, so another brain science concept, the reticular activating system. So the job of the reticular activating system is to filter out the perceptions that we have. That part of the brain, it receives 100 million impulses per second of sensory input. And as you can imagine, there's no possible way that our conscious brain could handle that fire hose of data. Its job is to only bubble up to your conscious awareness things that are relevant. And now this is why if you're at a party, you can hear your name called, name mentioned across the room, even though it's a busy party. It's the reason a sleeping mom can be awoken by the whimper of her baby 2 rooms over, but she's going to sleep through noisy traffic. It's also the reason when you buy a new car, all of a sudden you see everybody on the street is driving that new car. So the reticular activating system is bubbling up things that are relevant to us. Now let's talk about what's irrelevant. Like, how does the reticular activating system determines what's relevant? How it determines what's relevant is based on our expectations, our attitudes, our beliefs, our past experiences, our biases, our anxieties, fears, et cetera, et cetera. So things that don't align with our perspectives get filtered out. We don't even see them. Now, the problem with this, you can all imagine, is that perspectives become self-reinforcing, right? So we see whatever and we think it's an absolute truth, when really it was just a perspective. So can we use this to our advantage? So this is where the conversation starts to get a little bold, radical, audacious, and some people would call this BS. But hopefully with the brain science that I've shown so far, you can start to get what I'm talking about. Okay, so back when I was involved in these workshops, I was an assistant at one of these workshops one day, and it was in Portsmouth, and it was March. So I go to the instructor before everything starts, and it's a husband and wife team, and the wife is the instructor for the day, and the husband, he's equally trained, but he's not the instructor, he's just a facilitator. So anyway, the wife says to me, she says, "I want you to go outside and make a snowman so that when the people come into the workshop, they have something pretty to look at, to be greeted with." And the husband doesn't miss a beat. He says, "That's not going to happen." And so, and now I want to emphasize, this was a workshop about the nature of possibility and that possibility exists, and about goal achievement. And here was the instructor asking me for something, right? And the other instructor, without missing a beat, said, "That can't happen," right? So there's your can't do spirit right there. So anyway, I go outside and I look, and it's hard packed March snow, right? There's none of that sticky snow that you need snowman. It's literally, you could stand on top of these piles of snow next to the steps, and it was not a good scene. But here it was. I was at a workshop about the nature of possibility, goal achievement, and I was not about to go back into that room and tell the instructor that the thing that she asked me for cannot be done. So I stood I got pissed. I was cussing. I was kicking at the snow, probably hurting my foot in the process. I didn't know what to do, but I just sat with it. And I just sort of, eventually when I was done cussing, I sort of settled down, my mind a little bit, and I thought, I remember the whole Michelangelo quote that Michelangelo, when he sees a big block of granite, he removes everything from the block of granite that's not the sculpture, and then what he's left with is the beautiful sculpture. And I thought, geez, maybe I could do that. And I got a shovel, and I started carving out of this hard-packed snow, and I was able to carve out, this is not the actual snowman, stock photography, but I was able to carve out 3 balls, and I made a snowman, right? And I came in, goal achieved. So I mean, this story highlights a couple of things. One is that difficult goals are still achievable, but 2 is even people that practice this habit, right? Because these are people who are taught and trained, and they teach people how to use this method to their advantage, right? Thinking, speaking, and as acting as if the goal is easily achievable. And this guy was still stuck in that mental trap of, nope, it can't be done, right? And it goes back to, I was telling George one of the quotes when I started this. There's a wrote a book on character, and he said, writing a book on character doesn't give you character. And I would apply the same thing here. Telling everybody about these mental strategies doesn't make me somehow a master of them. I fail at these every day, but I use them, and I have seen them be successful enough times that I kind of stick with it. So, so if people think that what I'm getting at so far is sort of a glib statement, I wanted to just couch it in saying I'm not the only one that thinks this way. Einstein's got he's kind of, I think he's on board with what I'm trying to say. So when we fixate on a problem, right, that whole inattentional blindness can kick in, right, and that makes it hard for you to see the solution. So we reframe our mindset in terms of what's the opportunity, and then that makes it easier for our brains to work and have the solution be more readily available. So this is one of the slides I had earlier on. I don't want to recount a story. Okay, I'm at 12:30. I think I'm okay with time. So back when I was first learning this, I was at UNH in the photo lab, and I would work in the dark room, and then there was well, I guess at the time they called them secretaries or administrative assistants. I don't know what the right term is right now, but she was the front desk person, and she would come in and receive if somebody had needed some work done, right? Her name was Salim, and she said to me one day about a customer a frequent repeat customer coming in to do stuff. This woman was a professor at the EO science lab, and her name was Sherry. And Celine says, Dan, Sherry, she's not a nice person. She's really glum. She doesn't speak up. I don't like her. I don't think she's a nice person. And I was just starting to learn this. Celine, I'm not sure I agree with you. I think that Sherry might be responding to you. And I said, I'm going to do this experiment. Every time Sherry comes in, I'm going to be super nice to her, and we'll see what happens. And so it's like, okay, challenge. Right? And you can imagine what happened. Sherry would come in, hey, Sherry, how's it going? Oh, wow, this is great. Within no time, Sherry became not only a nice person, but probably one of Celine's favorite people to come in. And so Celine was stuck in problem. She was stuck in that my perception is reality, not perspective, right? And she was stuck in, this is difficult, right? And all I did was flip it around, and sure enough, Sherry showed up as a completely different person. Now, Sherry didn't change, but we changed, and she kind of mirrored it. All right. So here's another quote about problems becoming opportunities. And the goal of some of these quotes is really about talking about perspectives versus truth, right? We might see a problem and say, oh, this is really a problem. And these are examples of, well, let's say, what if your perception of this as a problem is really just one perspective, and are there other perspectives? And so here's an example I want to give, and this is a hypothetical one, but I'm sure it's happened in real life. Let's imagine a restaurant screws up your order, right? And you have a horrible experience, and you complain to the waiter. Now, there's two ways that the restaurant could behave. They could be like, oh, sorry, I guess it's just a bad day, right? And then you're out of there, and now it's a lose-lose, right? The restaurant has just lost a customer, and you've walked out disappointed. Or the restaurant could say, you know what, this is an opportunity. In fact, when we have our worst customers, those are our greatest opportunities, because that's when we can show what we're really made of. That's where we can show that we know how to do the right thing. And we're going to bend over backwards and say, what can we do, Mr. Customer, to have you walk out of here thrilled, right? And they might say, well, I need another meal. Or they might say, I want a gift certificate for another meal. Or they might say, I want a gift certificate, right? But at that point, now you've engaged in a conversation with the person about how can we turn this around, and I'm going to leave it at that. So I think I've said enough about that one. So so this is an excerpt from Robert Greenleaf's The Servant as Leader. So anybody that was in the last reading circle, I'm sure you're familiar with this. It's the parable of Jesus with the adulterer. And what I wanted to point out here, what I really loved about this, and actually Robert Greenleaf, that's the thing he pointed out here, is that when Jesus was faced in a difficult situation, right? He was in a social situation where he was looking at an angry crowd of people who disagreed with him. And Jesus needed to build consensus. I'm trying to couch this in business jargon, right? Because this is applicable here. Jesus needed to build consensus around his own idea. But what he did is, rather than go with his initial knee-jerk response, because he might have just come back and mirrored the angry mob and come back with an equally angry statement, and probably wouldn't have done so well. But he paused. He gave himself the mental space so that he could allow his brain to do the work to have a better outcome. And I would also assert that in doing this, Jesus was probably adopting a mental habit. I mean, I hope I'm not offending any religious sensibilities here, right? I'm not a religious scholar, but I think of this more from like a brain science perspective, that he was probably adopting a mental strategy that the outcome that I want to achieve is possible, and I just need to figure out how to get there from here. I'm not going to settle for, well, I couldn't build consensus with these people, so I guess we'll just abandon. So this is a funny one. As I was putting together this presentation, I ran into news that was really backing up these things. So this is just a story from last week. It's about walking away and washing your hands. Now, amazingly, I don't know if this falls under weird science or what, but psychologists, they wanted to see if you could shake off an old idea just by going washing your hands, and lo and behold, they found that you could. Now, I think that there's a lot of different ways that this could have worked, but if you're stuck in inattentional blindness, and if you know it, if you're like, sheesh, I'm in the middle of something and I really don't know what to do with this, walking away, stepping away, giving yourself that mental space is absolutely an effective strategy. And I would even say this from a developer's perspective. I don't know if there's any developers on the call, but I know personally so many times that I was stuck on a problem, and I was literally stuck on a problem for hours. And this is when I used to work from home, and I would say, that's it. I'm going to walk away from the computer. I'm going to mow the lawn. Right? I was that frustrated. I would go mow the lawn. Right? My brain is completely clear. I'm not thinking about the problem at all, or so I thought. Right? And then, right in the middle of mowing the lawn, poof, the solution pops into my head, and I run back up to the computer and I fixed it in 5 minutes. And isn't it interesting that 10 minutes of mowing the lawn could have saved me 4 hours of banging my head against a computer? So first, pop culture reference. This exact same principle, we've all seen it in Men in Black, and I actually brought it up in the last Community of Agile Practices, the Robert Greenleaf thing, right? So in every single Men in Black movie, there's this moment where where the Earth is under imminent destruction, and Agent J is flipping out, right? So he's that side, he represents that side of us that is stuck in this can't do it thinking. And then Agent K, he says, let's go have pie. And Agent J just finds this the height of irresponsibility. And lo and behold, at the end of eating pie, the solution pops into their heads, and they're off, and then they go and they solve the challenge. So, this is these concepts that I'm saying, they are in pop culture, and you can find them. And so anyway, moving along. So I actually, in the first draft of this, I had Tony Robbins in the beginning of the presentation, and I moved him to the middle. And he says, I listened to him on a recent TED Radio Hour, and he tried to boil down, and the narrator asked him to boil down his message into like one sentence, just like George did with me. And Tony said, look, it goes like this. We create stories about ourselves. And if that story doesn't work for you, kill your story. Now, the word story in that context, for some people, and I might even say a lot of people, it sounds offensive, it doesn't make sense. It's like, why are you telling me that my life circumstances is just a story, right? Because my life, maybe I had an absolutely horrible childhood, and for you to diminish that experience by merely calling it a story is offensive. All right, so I'm going to see if I can explain this. This picture. This picture is an example, and by the way, this is a staged photo. This was a stage for a magazine, so those are all models and actors there. But it highlights this sort of social anxiety when you feel like everyone's looking at you. So everybody's had this experience. You walk into a restaurant and you look around and everybody's looking at you. And you probably, maybe I'm the only one, but hopefully I'm not, and you get this creeped out feeling. You get this anxious feeling like, what's going on? And so what do you do, or what do I do? I might say, keep your head down, don't make eye contact, just get to your table as quick as possible, and then it's over. So what's going on with this? I would say what's going on is go back to that Lisa Feldman thing. We have a perception, we form a thought, a concept about it, and then from that springs an emotion. So what was my thought? My thought was, I'm in danger. My thought was, if I look at somebody, something's going to go badly, right? Maybe they're going to give me a dirty look, or maybe they're going to say, what are you looking at, or whatever. But you know what? Here's the thing. Are those thoughts reasonable? Do I actually have any evidence or experience where that's happened to me? I mean, some of us probably have. But I haven't. I mean, I've lived in rural New Hampshire all my life, and I've never had a bad experience walking into a restaurant. So let's flip the story. What if this perception? What if my concept of I'm in danger and I need to keep my head down, if it limited my range of outcomes? What if there's people in this room that I might need later on tonight if something happens? Or what if there's people that I might meet on the street soon? And so now, and what if by avoiding their glances, now they're creating a concept of me? And what's the concept they're creating of me? It might not be good. Oh, geez, that guy's not, he's not very nice, right? So what if just shooting someone a nice glance might completely change the story or change the outcome? Maybe they're just as anxious as we are, and maybe they weren't having a good day, and maybe just to go and send them a smile could utterly change the outcomes. So here's two columns, and I'm gonna say that these two columns represent two perspectives, right? And so I would ask, as you read these two columns, which one feels more like you? Which one feels more natural to you? Which one feels more like, yeah, that's kind of where I go to, right? And for me, it's the left. And for me, I look at the right and I'm like, geez, that's great. Those are all aspirational, but they don't come natural to me. But once again, I would go back to that when we lean towards the left, there is an implicit bias going on. There is some sort of brain wiring that has things connected in our head that aren't necessarily real, reasonable, evidence-based, etc., and that they can limit our effectiveness and limit our outcomes. Okay, so we're getting to how we can use all this brain science to our advantage, and this is where it's. We all remember, if you're old enough, you remember on SNL, Al Franken did his Stuart Smalley character, right, where he was into self-talk and he would say, "I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me," right? And that got all mocked. And you know what? I think those were hilarious too. But those I think unfortunately that mockery made it a little bit harder for us to have a serious conversation about some of the brain science and the value in some of this. And so this first statement, expect what you want, it sounds Pollyanna-ish, it sounds ridiculous, it doesn't make sense, but based on the brain science you've seen so far, my goal is that we flip around the whole inattentional blindness. And when you expect what you want, meaning let's say by what you want, it might be the goal. And I don't mean the goal in terms of necessarily like story points. The goal could be maybe you have to deal with another team. And maybe in the past, when you dealt with that team, you got pushed back and it just felt uncomfortable. So maybe your goal is next time you deal with that other team that it's just going to go better, right? So when we look at these sorts of things and we find evidence in our past experiences, maybe we're cherry picking that evidence. Maybe our brain is cherry picking that evidence to support our existing worldview. And maybe we can actively choose a perspective that's more useful. And it's going to feel unnatural at first. It's not going to feel right because you're going to say, look, I don't have any evidence that I'm going to be able to get along with this team. And I'm saying, forget about that because the evidence that you have so far might have been cherry picked. Okay, so hopefully you get the whole concept of killing your story. Now, George wanted me to title this presentation, and I really had a hard time titling it, and that's why my first slide was blank. I'm not really happy with any of the titles. But my first title was Midnight Confessions, because I thought that would get a lot of people in here. And so what I'm about to show you is Midnight Confessions. These are things that I'm letting you know, stories that I've had in my life that really didn't work for me. And they're kind of embarrassing to go over. But you know what? For the sake of this conversation, here we go. So this one, it doesn't feel like a story to me. And I think if there's other people who are sort of feel more introverted than extroverted, they might say, this isn't a story. This is how I am. This is who I am at my core. I'm absolutely an introvert. And you know what? That can be totally true. But, I brought this up to one of my instructors a very long time ago, and she said something that really broke it through for me. She said, let's try a different perspective. Instead of saying I'm shy, why don't you say I'm in self-concern? And what that means is when I walk into a room full of people, I'm more concerned about myself than I am about them. And she said, why don't you flip that around? And when you walk into a room full of people, why don't you take on being more concerned about them than you are about yourself? And I said, you know what? I'm an introvert, but I can do that, right? Because I know how to be of service and I know how to care more about someone else than myself. And that has helped me tremendously. It's not to say that I'm not still introverted. But it is to say that now I have a different perspective or a mental strategy that has helped me tremendously in those situations. So this one did a number on me too, right? I don't know. Maybe there are lots of people here whose moms just showered them with "You're so smart," and what mom would say that would have anything other than a beneficial effect? Well, in the 70s. There was, back when in the 70s, the big thing was like IQ, right? If you had an high IQ, then you're doing great. And so, I heard my IQ and I thought the number sounded good, right? It was above 100. So I'm like, great, I'm going to do well in life. So job done. I really don't need to put any effort. But here's the thing. And psychologists have sort of uncovered this in recent decades. They say there's either a fixed mindset or there's a growth mindset. And the fixed mindset says that the brain that you're born with as a kid, that's kind of like what you've got. You're locked and loaded, and if you have a crappy brain, then then you're SOL. And if you have a great brain, you're going to skate through. And recently with understanding neuroplasticity and stuff like that, we find that it just isn't true. When we adopt a growth mindset, brains do grow. You put in effort, you put in practice, right? You learn, and parts of your brain will actually physically grow to accommodate that. So when I was a kid growing up, I didn't want to take on any challenges because if I took on a challenge and then I failed, then the jig is up. And then my mom would realize that I wasn't smart and that I would lose my star status in her eyes and it would be terrible, right? So I became challenge averse. I became afraid to say, I don't know. I became threatened by others' intelligence. I became judgmental. I had to flip this around and adopt a growth mindset and realize, look, failure is evidence of willingness to take risks. So, and challenges are great because challenges are what allow me to grow my mind. So that's an example of a story that I've had that really didn't work for me and that I had to flip. This one is probably the most embarrassing one that I'm putting up there, but hey, full disclosure, I'm going to put it up there. When I was a kid, I would go to elementary school, right? This is in the 70s. You go out to recess. All the boys are doing boys things, and the girls are doing girls things, and the boys are going out to play kickball at the kickball field. And what happens? It's self-organizing democratic teams, right? So what happens is the two most charming, most athletic boys become the team captains, and then they go through and they alternate picking the kids, and then at the end of that, you picked all the teams. Well, over and over, I mean, I was out there, you can imagine this little beaming kid just wanting to be on these teams, and you really want to be picked first, right? Because if you're picked first, you're like super awesome. I was always the last or the next to last kid being picked, and that really did a number on me. It really hurt. But when you're 6 or 7 or 8, you really don't have the emotional maturity to be able to process that and understand that. So what did I do as a 6 or 7 or 8-year-old? I formed a concept called charming athletic netmen are dumb jerks, right? Because they hurt my feelings, because how come they didn't pick me, right? It wasn't, I didn't have the emotional maturity to say, well, I'm kind of shy and introverted, so I'm not really enamoring myself to them. And I know I'm not an athletic kid. I'm not going to kick the kickball very far. So I'm really not that valuable a player. So, give them some slack if they're going to pick me last. It's kind of like I would have done the same thing if I was the team captain. But you know what? Here's the thing. I internalized that at a very young age. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I realized, oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing this. And it was horrible. I was embarrassed, and I had to flip it around and just stop believing that. The worst guys of all of them, and this was when I was in high school, was the charming athletic guys who were also smarter than me. They drove me nuts, right? Because my story broke down. It didn't work. So anyway, now, this is an example. I wanted to show this slide to show, look, I am really familiar with all of the sort of disempowering thoughts that go through our minds on a day-to-day basis. And I'm not saying that I have mastered all these, but when I've adopted this habit, it has helped me to become self-aware of these sort of disempowering thoughts, and then I get to choose: do I really believe these? Are they evidence-based? Right? Can I really point to evidence that any of these things are really true, or are they just limiting my effectiveness? So, was there another one? Oh, I guess there was another one. Okay, so this is just to reiterate that thing I said at the beginning, right? So internal bias, it's there all the time, and it wires us up not just for things like racism and sexism, but it can wire us up for things like, that I might think that charming athletic men are jerks, or who knows what sort of baggage that we are carrying around with us from our childhood, and do we really want to take life advice from a 6 or 7-year-old? But that's kind of what we're doing. All right. Okay, so that's really the end of my talk. It looks like I'm at 12:51. I have a few more slides. They're kind of sort of philosophical. So George, what do you think? Should we open this up to questions at this point, or should I try to race through the rest of it?
Dan, up to you. Up to you.
Let me look at, how about this? If people have questions, can you post them in the conversation? And then, George, I'm not watching the conversation, but if you can watch it and just let me know if a question comes in.
Yes, we'll do.
Sound like a plan? Okay. All right. So, all right. So again, I am not a religious scholar by any means. I'm not an actively practicing Catholic. I was raised Catholic, but I'm not anymore. I'm very interested in religion and spirituality, but I hope to not offend anybody by these next few slides. So, so these are a bunch of quotes that I had seen all sort of glommed together. And it was Roger Walsh, The Transpersonal Movement, A History and State of the Art was the book that it came from. And I think these are really interesting because if sort of the slant of this talk is about self-awareness, right? Introspection, self-awareness, and that personal improvement and fulfillment can come from knowing yourself. All of these quotes that are, what, 2,000 plus years old, I think they're kind of sort of alluding to the same thing. So, make of it what you want. But the people that wrote these things 2,000 plus years ago, they didn't have the benefit of brain science and psychology and positive psychology and all that. And I wonder if they were around today, what they would think of all this stuff. And if they would think, oh yeah, that's what I was talking about. So that's my little aside about religion. So now I want to get into movies. Now I'm going to ask, what does this teenage girl have in common with this teenage boy? Have in common with this young boy? So the answer is they all follow the hero's journey. Now the hero's journey was kind of developed by this guy Joseph Campbell. He was a professor who studied mythology, and he looked at all sorts of myths around the world, and he found this formula that they all follow the same formula, right? So the hero, he begins in his day-to-day world with a problem. He's called to an adventure. He might receive sage advice or a mystical aid from an elder. He enters into some unknown world. I say he, but he or she, right? Like Dorothy. He's transformed, faces a challenge, has a revelation, overcomes his fears, and he's victorious. He's rewarded and returned to the normal world changed. Okay, so I'm here to argue that the hero's journey it sounds really similar to what I'm talking about today. Now, if you look at that outer green ring, and you read those, you could, and if you ask yourself, geez, with this sort of, I'm not going to say new, but with the concepts that I'm going over today, do you feel like you're somewhere on that ring, right? You have increased awareness. Maybe you're reluctant to change. Maybe you have overcome your reluctance. You're committed to it. You're gonna go out and experiment with the first change, etc. Right? So there you go. And now just to back up a second. So George Lucas was a friend of Joseph Campbell, and he set out to cast Star Wars as a modern myth, and it wasn't by accident. George explicitly wrote it to follow the hero's journey. So you can watch Star Wars and you can map it to this 100%. A lot of people credit the massive success of Star Wars to that, and I would argue Harry Potter and the Wizard of Oz also. They follow the same thing. This is a great quote from Joseph Campbell that I think sums up the hero's journey. And obviously it's a metaphor, right? The jewel you seek is in the cave you fear to enter. So, I would ask, why has humanity told and retold the same myth in different ways over and over for thousands of years? So, so I'm gonna be audacious and try to posit an answer here, and it ties in with this talk today. What if one of the central issues of humanity is how to deal with life's challenges? Is the cave that we fear to enter any of life's challenges, fears, or anxiety? Is the elder somebody who shows us a new perspective that challenges or changes our existing one that has been limiting us? Is the mystical aid might be the courage to try out this new scary perspective? Is the danger our current limiting perspective that we've mistaken as real? With our new courage and our new perspective, we go out and we face our fears into astonishment. It works. The jewel we are rewarded with is the new power that our new perspective unlocks. We return to the world is changed for us, but merely because we see it differently. All right, so that's the end of my presentation. I want to just throw in a few caveats. Because I said at the beginning that I'm not a metaphysician. I don't believe in any sort of mystical power of your thoughts creating reality. It's pure brain science. I'm not saying that you can fix brain or body issues by thinking them away. If you have diabetes, or if you have chronic pain like I do, or if you have chronic anxiety or depression or a broken leg or Asperger's or autism or any of that, you need to see a doctor, right? You can't just go and say, well, I'm just going to go think this stuff away. I would also say that these mindsets can be abused, and the Stuart Smalley character is a wonderful example of someone who adopts this mindset to be a bludgeon for others. So, and I would say, look out for red flags. We still need to be evidence-based, right? If you, this is we rarely ever encounter people that we think that we fear for our safety around here, but in general, if you encounter someone that you fear for your safety, I'm not telling you to go out and just think the problem away, right? Get away and get to a safe place. Don't let this strategy overlook red flags.